this supposed to work?
I do not know.
Okay.
We're on.
Apparently it doesn't, and this doesn't seem to work either. Is this supposed to work?
It's just decoration, Sean.
Yeah.
Hey, it just works.
Well, I've got the choice of this or the page down keys, and neither of them seem to be operating here. So.
Keyboard's not working. Keyboard's not working.
Keyboard's not working. Or I guess it's probably because I'm operating it from here. There we go. Yeah. No, yeah. It's okay. I'll just use this. Should we get started?
Yeah.
Is that
Okay.
on this computer?
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, we
Okay.
figured it out.
Yeah.
Should we put the title on? There we go.
All right. Okay, let's get started. Thank you all for coming. Always appreciate an audience that shows up after a night of open bar at a nightclub. And, you deserve to be congratulated for that. My name is Shyam Pather. I'm a development lead on the ADO.NET team at Microsoft, and with me is Sam Drucker. He's the product unit manager for Microsoft's data programmability team. And the title of our talk today is Rapidly Building Data-Driven Web Pages with ADO.NET. So it's kind of wordy. We didn't pick it. For those of you who haven't made the connection yet, this is the Jasper talk. So we announced a project codenamed Jasper on Monday, and here you're going to learn about what it is and how to do it. And we thought we had the longest session title at MIX, but I believe that honor goes to the Building Web-Based Line of Business Applications on the Microsoft Dynamics Live CRM Platform talk, which I believe is in this room next, so you can stick around for that if you want. All right, so let's get into this. So I have a bunch of words on the screen, and I want you to think about these words in the context of a development experience when you build an application that serves up data. So how many people here have built, say, an ASP.NET application that takes data from a database, shows it in a form? A number of people have done that. Okay. So does anybody think that these words in particular apply to your development experience? Is it quick, clean, intuitive? Probably not today, right? You're dealing with APIs that are very powerful and very flexible, but with that power and flexibility comes some complexities, some things that get in your way when you want to get something up and running quickly. So with Microsoft codename Jasper, project we announced on Monday, we are trying to change that. There's some work we've done around the data access story to make it more quick, more clean, more rapid, more intuitive. And we're going to show you that work today. So to put this in context, we're going to begin with a demo. So we're going to build a data-driven web application, and I'm going to use Jasper to do it. And there you can see throughout this deck, I have sprinkled in some pictures from Jasper National Park, which is the inspiration for the product codename. And so in this first demo, we're going to build a data-driven web app. It's going to do some reasonably sophisticated things. We're going to have hierarchical data binding. We're going to have insert, update, and delete functionality. And I'm going to do this without any generated code and with no configuration to speak of. So let's get right into that. So I'm going to switch out of my slides. And first thing that I'm going to do is show you the database that I'm going to use to back this. Actually, before I show you the database, I'm going to show you a mock-up of the application itself. So here's the application we're going to build. It's a sort of community news site, place where people can go and post stories about data access, tag them, and then have other people come look at them and share that information. So we call this Data Access City. And we've got some links in here, topics, tags, and so on. So this is just a static HTML mock-up of the application. And we're going to go into building this with ASP.NET. So let's look at the database we've got behind this. So I've got a Data Access City database. And in it, I've got 4 tables: stories, submitters, tags, and topics. And this will form the basis of the application that I'm going to build. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio in a moment and do all the web stuff. But before I do that, I'm going to invite Sam to come and show you some of the core of the Data Access API that we're going to build the web application around. And to do that, we're going to use the most simple, bare-bones environment possible, which is the IronPython console. And we'll show you the Data Access APIs that you can use from scripting languages like IronPython, and then we'll move into using them in a web application.
So this is just a fresh IronPython environment. By the way, this is the part of the presentation where we say this is so easy, even a pointy-haired manager can do it. That would be my role. And we're going to go ahead and load the usual system references. And this is really boring stuff, but we wanted to prove this is a clean environment to work from. We're going to go ahead and load the Jasper CTP. We'll tell you a little bit about how you can get that and start playing with that yourself. We'll import the names. And we have a few helpers that we built, just the connection strings. Sham said no configuration to speak of. This is the very minimal configuration that we have. And in fact, just to show what we're talking about, this is a traditional configuration management string. Connection string. You can see we're naming the provider. We're saying where the database is, which is here. And then if you notice very carefully at the end, we have a little thing about generated default EDM equal true. And I'm not going to tell you what that does. We're going to talk about the EDM a little bit later.
And notice this is a connection string to the database that I showed a moment ago.
Exactly. So we're going to go ahead and create a thing called a dynamic context. Now, the dynamic context is the first bit of new wiring here. And this is a traditional connection object, but it has an object context to it. So it's going to populate itself with some objects and types that represent what's in the database. We'll talk a little bit more about how that exactly is done, but this is a big part of the magic in the middle that happens for this stuff. So we'll go ahead and create one. So we've created the connection object, and what that's going to do is it's going to connect to the database, and as it's connecting, it's going to go in and it's going to look at the catalog, it's going to read about the tables, it's going to create new collections that represent the tables that are in the database, the tables that Sham showed you a second ago. It's going to go and look at things like foreign key relationships. It's actually going to infer some relationships or associations. We're going to use those in the course of what we're going to do with the database itself. So in this environment, now that we've created this, really, again, with no pre-generated code or minimal configuration, we could go change the schema. It would actually change the results that we get in the prompts that we have here. And we'll look at one of these objects. So stories is an object or a property of the connection that has been generated on the fly from the connection after the dynamic context has gone and actually looked at the catalog. If we return the object here, it returns as a query object, and that query represents the collection of things that are in the stories table in the database. We'll do something slightly more interesting. We'll go grab one of those objects, and we'll just pick the first one out. And we'll look at a couple properties. And again, not only have we sort of elevated these things into the connection as exposed properties, but you can go and grab these. And you have these as just regular CLR objects. And this is the sort of OR wiring that's in the glue here. And they're just regular old CLR objects now. So we can go grab the description. We've got an article from Julie Lerman. Of course she's here. It's an ADO.NET talk. I can't imagine a talk without Julie here. We can go in and look at the title, what to expect next in the Orcus bits for the entity framework. Slightly ironic, but not too bad. We can look at the published date. And of course, this is not just a string. This is actually a regular old date-time object, which you can manipulate with all the date-time ways. You don't have to do conversion on the fly and all that stuff. So having looked at all that, let's issue a real query. By the way, feel free to stop us with questions midstream. We're at least somewhat interactive, or would like to be somewhat interactive. So we're doing something a little more complicated here. We're actually building a query. The result of that query is going to be in the collection My Stories. We're leaning on the entity framework here in that we're taking the stories collection. We're using the where function to build a fragment of a query from entity SQL or eSQL. That's the fragment that's in the quotes there. This is Python, of course, so we don't have link support in this environment. Submitter.name is the kind of cool thing there. Submitter as you remember, is another table in the database. Now, those tables are related with primary key, foreign key relationship. The dynamic context has gone in, read that out of the catalog, and inferred a schematized relationship and added a navigation property to it that is accessible from SQL. So rather than having to type all the foreign key stuff directly into your query and make sure you spell it right and those quotation marks and all that good stuff, we actually just give you a nice schematized navigation property, it.submitter.name. Name, of course, is a property that's from the submitter table, and we're going to process the filter against that. Make sense? Good. Cool. So we will just iterate through that. And again, we're getting these nice CLR objects back, so all the usual. What's that?
Published.
Thank you. So we got 3 that match from Huddlemaster, and it just comes out. And of course, we're printing out from the, again, the properties that are just exposed courtesy of the underlying OR framework from the.
And one of the things that's interesting here, so Sam is doing this to show, the basic API, but this is a sort of useful thing if you're working against a database that you're unfamiliar with and you want to poke around and explore the data and run some queries with code. You can use this kind of interactive environment to do that with no setup ahead of time. So these data classes and everything are just populated on the fly.
It's nice for the ad hoc sort of data management, cleansing, reporting type applications.
If we got a question back here. So we rely on the late binding mechanisms in some of these dynamic languages for this. So at the moment, C# doesn't work. We're looking at ways to make that work a little later on. Well, the fact that C# doesn't have the concept of late binding today, I mean, you can use it through reflection, but that's sort of counter to the rapid experience as well, right?
Basically, any of the .NET languages that have a dynamic context, Python's a clean example here, but of course Visual Basic works as well. It's a little more similar to things that we do like in the XML support for Visual Basic, where we're loading XSDs in the background and doing dynamic typing with IntelliSense in the background. So we'll show this later. We don't really have the IntelliSense working on the dynamic context stuff here, but it's very similar to the work we've already done on the XML side, and we do hope to work on that. Does that answer the question? No, on the IntelliSense support. That's kind of up to some joint work we'll have to do with the C# team. It's a much broader topic for them. It's hard to take a well-designed static-bound language and make it amenable to dynamic languages, but we'll have to see what they want to do. So let me plunge ahead on this front.
So let's follow up with that at the end. I want to show you guys more of the demo. This may become a bit more clear, and then we'll get to that. We can bring that question up at the end.
So I'm just going to go back to our first story there off the back. I'm going to remind you we had the title or the publish date. One of the things that we get by using the underlying ADO.NET framework is we get a two-way pipeline. So not only can you pull these into views and have a nice read environment for looking at all this stuff, but the full pipeline works. So you got a query pipeline and, of course, an update pipeline. So we can take the, so we can actually do, and we could say refresh the publish date pretty easily by just going ahead and executing an update. This has changed the local object. Now we'll go back to the connection, and we can save that into the database pretty easily. Boom. That's actually going to go and take the story object that we've pulled the data into. It'll look for differences from what was pulled in from the database originally. It'll compute that update statement. It'll map it back into the tables that we have in the database, and it'll flush that change to the database, updating the durable record of it. So the pipeline works both coming up and coming back down. And of course, there are more complicated updates you could do. And I'm going to choose a slightly fancier way of actually showing that flush went through. We're going to go back to the stories collection, and we're going to do another eSQL fragment here. We're going to use order by, and we're going to order by the publish date. See, I told you it was SQL. We have the nice descend clause. And we will see that this is refreshed, and Julie's article is now at the top of the list, having been updated today. So again, this is this dynamic glue that's built on top of the entity framework. The entity framework is giving us this update pipeline and the published pipeline and the version of SQL that understands these things, the navigation properties and the other entity-ness of the thing. So very simple command prompt example. Shyam's going to show something a little more interesting.
Okay, so that was designed to show you just the absolute bare bones data access, and we'll show you now the web development experience that we've built around that with some additional components. So I have here a skeleton web project that has just some placeholder stuff that you probably don't want to watch me type. And this is going to be the skeleton for that web app that I showed you the mock-up of a moment ago. So just quickly going over what's in here, I've got some project settings. I've got a default ASPX page, which is right now just has the kind of outline for the application. And in this, one item of note is that we're using this list view control, which is a new ASP.NET control in Orcus. It's designed to replace the data list and repeater controls. It's got a little bit of better support for CSS and layout control and so on. And in there, we're gonna put some markup. So more than what's in the project, what's more interesting is what's not in the project. I have not defined any data classes statically. I don't have a story class defined or any VB files associated with that. Those things are going to be available to me at runtime purely because of the Jasper engine. So first thing that I do with Jasper web development is put on the page an object, a control we call a Jasper auto data source. So an auto data source is an ASP.NET component that will source data from a Jasper database and will make it available to the web application, as well as bind that data automatically to web controls. So with that auto data source in place, that simply declares that it exists. And if I go to the code behind for the page, I have to hook that auto data source up to my connection. So what I'm going to do is I have a web.config here, which has got in it one of the connection strings, a lot like the one that Sam used in the Python demo. So again, we've got this generate default EDM equals true connection string parameter, and that's going to tell the Jasper engine to go look at the database schema, generate the data classes, and bring them back into the program. So I'm going to get at that connection string. So I'm going to write a little bit of VB code here to do that. And I'm going to use the configuration manager APIs to get at it. Connection strings, and my connection string was called data access city, and the connection string. And now I'm going to go create one of these dynamic context objects that Sam showed in the previous demo with the connection string as its parameter. And on my auto data source, I'm going to set that dynamic context property that I just created. Now, one of the things here, so this is the basic code that you need. One of the things that you notice in the Python demo is going to the database and creating that dynamic context was a bit of an expensive operation. So I don't want to do that every time. So in the my reference here, where I've got a property for dynamic context, we actually have caching of that property enabled. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first, before going into that, check whether that dynamic context has been created, and only if it has not will I run this code here. So now the application doesn't have much in it yet. It's just the basic layout template. But by doing these few lines of code, I've enabled it for Jasper development. What I'm able to do after this is just drop on a bunch of controls and have them automatically wired up to my data. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to go back to the default ASPX page. And in here, I've got a couple of things. So I'm just going to cut and paste this because this is standard ASP.NET markup code. So I've got a data list in here that's going to show me the topics. And one of the things that's interesting is I'm not going to write any data binding code. I'm simply going to name these controls after the things that I want them to display. So in this case, I want to display topics, so I'm just going to call that topics. And with the Jasper auto data source, that wiring relationship between the topics data and that control is going to happen automatically. Now you'll notice I'm going to drop what looks like a bunch of markup, or a lot of markup here, but this is all the standard stuff that you would do to define the look and feel of your application. So I'm going here with not quite a scaffolding approach. I'm actually building the UI that I want to have. But instead of focusing on all the plumbing stuff about hooking up these controls to data and writing SQL queries and dealing with my database schema, all I'm doing is dropping the controls on the page and naming them appropriately. So with this markup in place, I can run the application. And you're going to have to bear with me the first time because doing the connection to the database and getting the schema, as I said, is a bit of an expensive operation that happens the first time. So you'll notice a delay in here. But while this is occurring, I'll take a few questions if there's anybody's got something quick. Yeah.
This is going to be included in Visual Studio.
So this, at the moment, is an incubation project for us. So we have a CTP of it available, and that includes some project templates for Visual Studio and so on that let you build an app quickly. Future release plans for this are unknown at this point. Right? We're here to get feedback, and we'll decide about how it fits into the product based on the feedback and iterations that we do. So here's the app up and running. So with that markup in there, no data class generation, no data binding code written. Everything just automatically gets hooked up, and I have my links working and the data binding just happening. And I can see Julie smiling over there because her story, again, is number one on the talk here. So, OK, so we're at a Web 2.0 conference, and I'm a sort of Web 1.0 platforms kind of guy, so this is a bit of a stretch for me. We wanted to do things like rounded corners and stuff on the site, but ran out of time. We do have a little RSS logo there, which I think is pretty Web 2.0. But it wouldn't be Web 2.0 if we didn't have a tag cloud. Right? So let's go and look at what it takes to build a tag cloud. So for that, we grabbed a tag cloud control from the code project website, and we're going to use that in the application here. So let me go back to my markup and put that in. So I've got a div here for the tag cloud. So I'm going to put the markup for this in. And going back to my code behind page, I'll show you that markup in just a moment, what that does. Let's see, where's the tag cloud query? I'm going to drag this onto my surface here. Here we're going to do, we're going to use another feature of the auto data source. So previously, I didn't tell the auto data source anything about binding. It just automatically figured stuff out based on names. Now, I also have the ability to bind specific things to specific controls without a lot of configuration. So here, I'm binding, using the auto bind method of my auto data source, I'm binding the tags control to the result of a query over the tags property on my dynamic context, which, of course, was generated at runtime. And here, the query that we're doing, we're going over tags. We're grouping them by tag name. And we're just doing a projection of the tag name and the count of tags with that name and calling that weight. And if we look at the markup for the tag cloud here, it uses weight to determine how big to display the titles in the tag cloud. So that's the basic tag cloud stuff. I want to do one additional thing before running the application. We had links in there for tags and for topics. I want to make those work. So in my VB code here, I'm going to write a little more code. And this is going to allow me to filter the stories on tag or topic, and it'll make that tag cloud a little bit more interactive. So this page takes topic ID or query or tag name as query string parameters. So I'll just grab those from the query string. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to show you some more aspects of the API and the ability to use link with the Visual Basic API that we've got going on here. So I'm getting from my query string a tag or a topic ID. And those things could be null, so I have to check for those. So I'll just look at and say, if topic ID is not nothing, then I'm going to do a query by topic ID. Else, we'll look at the tag. And this should be else if. And I'm going to do a query by tag in there. So I'm going to dim up an object that I'll call stories query. And I'm going to show two query mechanisms here. So you've already seen entity SQL. I'll show you another quick example of that, and then I'll show you a link query as well. So in this case, where I have a topic, I'm going to say my stories query is my dynamic context stories. And here's, unfortunately, you don't see IntelliSense right now because we don't have that hooked up with the late binding mechanism. We'll talk more about that later. And I'm going to check, I'm going to get stories where the topic ID equals a topic ID parameter that I'm going to create. And for that, I'll need a new object parameter, call it topic ID, and give it the value topic ID. Now, one of the problems I'm going to have here is topic ID that came in from the query string is a string. So I'm going to have to cast this to an integer for this to work, but that's a fairly simple operation, and that should give me my stories. And once I have that, I'm going to use the auto binder, or auto data source, to auto bind this query to the stories control. And or actually, I'm not even going to specify the control. We'll just give the stories query here. And I'll show you two modes of this. One is where I just give the query, and based on the type that comes back, it'll figure out from the control names what to bind to. And I'll show a link query, and I'll do it the other way. So for link, I'm going to do this. So I'm going to say stories query equals from t in my dynamic context tags. Oops. And I got to put my little underscores here. So I'm going to say where t.tag name equals tag. I keep forgetting my little underscores at the end. My VB syntax is a little off today. So I'm going to select the story, and I'm going to select the distinct ones. Now, you'll notice that there's a blue squiggly line under this. And the reason that happens is today in Visual Basic, for a link query to work, the object that I'm querying over has to be statically typed as an enumerable. And in this dynamic world, VB doesn't know what the type of that tags thing is. So there's some work to do here. Obviously, link and dynamic languages need to work together. We're just at the stage right now where we're not quite there. So one thing I need to do, and this is a temporary thing, is cast this to an interface iQuery, which is enumerable, so that the compiler can deal with that appropriately. So once I've created that query, we'll go here and auto bind it again with the auto data source. And here, I will show you the ability to actually specify a control. So I want to now bind stories to my stories query. So having done that, basically got the functionality of the application working, we can try and run it and see what happens. Did I probably type something wrong here? Missing a closed parentheses here. So that way you know this is a real demo because I'm getting compile errors. And we're going to run this. So again, because I've restarted my session, I'm going to hit that delay again on startup. So I'll take another question while this is going. Yeah, question back there.
What's the upper limit of projects that you guys intend to use technology?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the.
4 tables.
That's right.
It takes a while to pull this.
So
What are 4 tables?
hold that question till a little bit later in the talk where I show how this scales to more complicated databases. So in here now, I've got the app working. You'll notice my tag cloud, very Web 2.0 with the tags scaled appropriately by size. All came through that control, and that control was bound to an arbitrary query. And we have the ability to filter based on topics. So I click on ADO.net, and what I see here is all the ADO.net topics. If I click on VB, I can then see all the VB topics that show up. So that's a basic app. I'm going to come back a little later and refine it a little bit more. But in a nutshell, I wrote some markup, I wrote some code, and I got the two to work together. And even though it looked like I typed a lot of code, the code that I typed was specific to my application. I didn't waste any time on defining data classes that already exist in schema. I didn't waste any time on plumbing. I just got the exact logic that I wanted in my application, which from a developer point of view is exactly the experience I want. So with that, I'm going to switch back to the slides and talk a little bit more about some of the technology behind this, and we'll come back and do a little more demo as we move on. right. So this was my demo that you just saw. So this is the agenda. We're going to quickly go through a little bit about the project itself, Jasper. We'll do a technical walkthrough, talk specifically about some details of ASP.NET development, then look at extending the Jasper data classes that were auto-generated with some custom business logic and behavior that isn't just populated automatically from the database schema. And in the last section, we'll come back to the question from the gentleman in the back about how does this work with real-world databases? And one aspect is database size, but there's also database complexity. And we'll talk about that in the last section. So to go into it, the goal of Jasper is to enable rapid and iterative development of data-serving applications. Our target scenarios are forms over data, which in some ways any database application is. I have a UI and there's a database behind it, and I got to get data traveling back and forth. And one of the inspirations for Jasper was we got feedback from customers that say, over the past 20 years, the experience of building forms over data hasn't changed. Like, you keep changing the data access APIs, but I still have to work just as hard to get it to work. So this project is in some ways a reaction to that and an attempt to try to make that experience better. So forms over data is one scenario. The other one that we started out as sort of an experimental thing, but then turned out to be useful, is the ability to interactively explore data with code. So the experience Sam went through in the Python environment, where he was just sort of tab completing to see what's in the database and be able to run queries on the fly without a lot of setup, that's a useful experience when you're working with a new database or something that you want to just play with to see how it works. So, the two takeaways, if you don't take anything else away from this talk, the two things you need to know about Jasper. One is that data classes are inferred at runtime. That means there's no generated source files to deal with, and a lot of the complexity is moved away from the development experience. And then there's the auto data binding that you saw in the demo. So what we want to go for, point at a database and begin coding. We wanted to give you one simple way to do things and have this work with real-world databases. Right? It's very well and good for me to work in my ideal demo database, but in the real world, this should work too. And what we were specifically trying to avoid is excessive configuration, heavyweight tools, or source files that you then have to go manage and maintain after the fact. So the good news is the CTP for Jasper is available today. That URL is the URL for the Data Access Incubations project page, where you'll find a download for both Jasper and Astoria. And the key point is we're here to get feedback. This is an incubation project for us. It started in the ADO.NET team. The original idea came from a guy named Andy Conrad, whose blog some of you probably read, and has become a collaboration between ADO.NET, the VB team, ASP.NET, and the CLR team, or specifically the DLR subset of the CLR team. So we're here to get feedback, and we'd like to get opinions on how well you think this works. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam. He's going to drive for a little while, and I'll come back later to do another demo.
So I'm going to walk through some of the major parts of what sort of makes up the Jasper engine, a little bit about how it works, and what's relevant about how this provides some of the functionality that we've been talking about in the demos. This is the sort of slideware repeat for some of the wiring that you saw, hopefully with a little more rationale behind it. So Jasper is another programming interface to your data, but it is an API surface that is tailored for development in a dynamic language environment. So we do use the trick of building these types on the fly, and we use a lot of correspondences in the type system to make wiring that has been very manual and very time-consuming just work. We're really trying to concentrate on reducing the number of lines of code it takes to actually build something useful. Theory being the less lines of code you have, the easier it is to maintain, the faster it is to build, and lots of good things happen. The trick about it is to do it in a way where we leverage all the capabilities that we have in ASP.NET, the ADO.NET Entity Framework, and other parts of the system, so that as we do need to build up for scale, for complexity, or even just to learn the thing in the first place, we don't introduce a lot of new concepts and completely replace the framework that you're used to using. It is about data access and data binding. This, what we didn't want to do is generate a lot of source code that you then had to maintain in parallel with the database schema that you're already maintaining. Again, that sort of duplication of locality of reference is what adds to the maintenance headache. It's what adds to the complex configuration. That's something we're trying to eliminate. So there's way of thinking about Jasper and the components that it is that's really this sort of magic in the middle picture. We have the database on one side. We have a clean query pipeline to it, the plumbing of which is a traditional ADO.NET plumbing, and then the entity framework on top of that. And that also provides a clean update pipeline. So we still have a full fidelity data access API that you're working with. What we've really done is just select out those pieces where we can really benefit from eliminating that manual wiring and put that in the Jasper engine. On the other side of it, we have the object API. Well, now we have a real sort of object relational API built into ADO.NET, and the UI binding engines that you've seen for ASP.NET, and we'll also talk about some of the other binding engines itself. So as Sham said, those are the two pieces that make up Jasper to begin with. So building on the entity framework, there is the data class inference engine, which is the thing that when you build the dynamic connection, it goes and reads the catalog and builds that model. Now, because this is built on top of the entity framework, that model is itself a nice, clean artifact. And even though we're building it at runtime here, you actually get a model that can be further customized, saved out, or optimized for later deployment and scale, and we'll talk about more of that later. The Jasper APIs there are the link to the various binding engines depending on the forms environment you're using. We've got ASP.NET, WinForms, and WPF. And those are the things that bridge the glue from data binding into the type inference engine that is the heart of Jasper in the first place. So it leans on the OR framework to build up those APIs. The data classes that are generated in the underlying structure are built in the context of that OR framework that's in the ADO.NET entity framework. The binding engine, of course, then uses the metadata from that OR framework to wire it into the specific forms packages. How many of you are sort of vaguely familiar with the ADO.NET entity framework? Okay, I'll talk a little bit about it later. You don't count. The things to know there is that it's got a rich mapping engine. It provides our entity SQL query pipeline, and it layers over ADO.NET 2.0 data provider. So it goes cross-platform, multi-store, and all that good stuff. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Like now. Smooth transition? Good. So there are really two pieces to know about with the entity framework. One is that we've created this thing called the EDM. The EDM, or the entity data model, provides a higher level abstraction for data in the store. That is entities. It's a variant of the traditional ER model that's been around since Peter's paper was in 1976, I think. But it's brought into here as a runtime abstraction, not as an Irwin diagram pegged to the wall. There is an artifact that is the model that describes the things that you have. It gives you a schematized way to represent associations and relationships. That's part of that higher level of abstraction. It's a little easier to name a navigation property or to combine a denormalized view of an employee instead of having to remember how to join three tables in order to update an employee record. It is, in many ways, a successor to the core relational model. It's a part of the Microsoft Data Platform Initiative. That's part of things we're doing in SQL Server and other parts of the enterprise software world. It is still relational. You can still run strong query over it. You still get all of the nice things that we've learned to love in the last 33 years of building relational databases. And it adds really three main concepts: formal relationships, inheritance, and composition. And I won't go into too much detail on that stuff. In ADO.NET Entity Framework, we add some services built around having these kind of models in the environment. One is that we provide a .NET Object API for manipulating that data. So once you've defined a stories entity or a customer entity, you can just work with a customer object and it maps in the natural sort of business object way. Secondly, we've built a runtime mapping engine that can construct these things from regular old tables and keys. So you can start using the model even though your database isn't natively speaking EDM to you at the moment. That'll change over time. There's a query pipeline that supports both LINQ and Entity SQL. It has this provider model to talk to various databases. There are private versions of ADO.NET Entity Framework providers that are out there. There are even some that have been released in conjunction with our CTPs. I believe SQLite and I won't name the other one because I don't know if I'm supposed to, but there are lots of other stores that you can get to. It also provides a stronger pipeline for managing metadata in more flexible deployment areas. Once we go to the trouble of building a client-side view manager, it's nice to have that metadata available in a way that we can do things programmatically to the model. And in fact, we'll see some examples of that later in the talk.
So before you switch off the slide, so I got to say, so all of this stuff is ADO.entity framework. Very powerful, very flexible. The joke that we have on the Jasper team is that Jasper is the easy button for the entity framework, because none of the stuff that you normally do around configuration and all that is there. I mean, that stuff is very useful for certain environments, and in fact, we'll show an example of that later. But when you want to get up and running quickly, Jasper does all that stuff for you.
So it's a great point, Sham. The entity framework is immensely powerful, but in the true sense of enterprise databases, it has all the power that you could want. Jasper is the way to coalesce it in a way that is targeted for these scenarios that we've talked about today, and is one of the easier versions of it. You'll get arrows for the rest of it later, I'm sure. Yeah. So we're going to go through the parts of the Jasper API, sort of an overview of the API itself. The first thing is that dynamic context class. So this is where your connection string goes. It serves as the overall container for stuff in the database. It's the .NET class view of what's in there. It exposes properties that correspond to the tables or those collections of things. It exposes those navigation elements that let you walk relationships. The underlying machinery does things like change tracking and identity resolution, which is what lets us compute those update grams and do all that fun stuff. We've seen this a couple of times now, but at the bottom you can see orders.items, and we can navigate through those collections in the nice sort of expected .NET way. It has query pipeline, and that's manifested in the API as a query class. So this is a thing where you can build queries into a language construct, whether you're doing entity SQL and you're building an object up as you specify those fragments and helper functions in the usual sort of ADO.NET 2.0 way, or whether you're using the new link facilities either in Visual Basic or C#. It actually runs a common pipeline with a common set of semantics, and that reaches into the update pipeline as well. Everyone know what link is? Good? Yeah, good. Excellent. The data classes are the things that represent the entities in the database. So the stories, the story class, the customer class from Northwind, the contact class, the submitter class. Those classes actually represent things in the model, which in turn represent things in the database. And so the way that the entity data model works is we infer this relationship, the EDM model, which has the entities and the relationships. And that's the higher abstraction that we built by reading the catalog, inferring the primary key relationships. You can also, in the framework, of course, just build one of these, or you might have one that someone in your company built for the database that represents the runtime structure of what the database is in your programming environment. And using the model itself is a matter of injecting it into the connection string.
And to be clear, in the default case where you're not specifically doing that, you don't ever have to deal with the entity data model or source files. It just kind of happens under the hoods. If
the defaults work for you, this is just plumbing that you don't really have to worry about too much. The dynamic context will create those data classes for you at runtime. You can use it at compile time via late binding. It is building that EDM sort of under the hood, and it is doing type inference over the model itself to populate the context that we saw. Is that clear? We've said that a couple different ways. I want to make sure that that's a really key point. That's the heart of what the Jasper engine does for typing. Okay.
Okay, so with ASP.NET, you've seen some of this already. We have this auto data source component that will be, it is a full ASP.NET data source control, just like SQL data source, object data source, and so on that you know today. But it has two interesting features. One is the ability to just connect to Jasper data stores without queries being specified. And the other is to automatically configure the binding of web controls. And we use naming conventions to do that automatic binding. So you can bind straight to entity sets, or effectively tables in the database. You can navigate over relationships and do master detail that way, again, purely on naming convention. Or you can bind to arbitrary queries, like I showed in the tag cloud example earlier on. And the auto data source control supports read and write operations. So if I bind that to a grid or something and I have an edit button, I can go back and propagate those changes straight back to the database.
Let me say one thing about the arbitrary queries. Not just arbitrary queries that may be in the code, but in fact queries that can be built up dynamically over the runtime of the application.
Yep.
So if your navigation can be built directly over a query builder mechanism which issues these dynamic queries.
So this slide here shows the basic code involved. And this is a busy slide, so I try to find ways to reduce this. But in the end, I decided to leave it because even though it's busy, this is all the code you need to build a hierarchical data binding ASP.NET application. So declare the auto data source. In the code behind, connect up the auto data source to a connection string, or to a dynamic context built from a connection string. And then in this example, I create a list box and a details view. And the particular database schema I had here was categories and products. But I can display category names in the list box, and I can display the products related to categories in the list and the details view purely through those naming conventions. And those naming conventions are described in detail in the Jasper overview doc that ships with the CTP, so you know what to expect.
Question?
We're programmers. We don't often get to build our own databases.
Yeah.
If there are multiple tables that have a field with the same name,
Yep.
how does Jasper do it?
So let me get to that in a little bit later, right? So I'm going to talk about non-trivial databases a little bit later in the talk.
That's in the real world section.
And if I forget to answer that question, please remind me again. So, okay, so I want to show the next piece, back to demo, less slides, more demo. So there's a little joke about this slide here. I put this slide on. This was a picture taken from in Jasper. And that's actually a sheep. And most people go, hey, you have a mistake on your slide. It's a goat, not a sheep. And I say, no, it's in fact a sheep. And then there's the joke about, well, why do you know so much about the sheep? So let me get quickly into the demo here.
I wouldn't have admitted to that.
Taking one for the team here. All right, so business logic, right? So we generated these data classes, read and write operations happen. But what happens if I want to go inject some logic in there to do something non-standard? So in the example that we have, let me just switch to the mock-up page again. You'll see that we have this nice feature where on the email addresses, we display this, the @ sign in text rather than using the @ sign. And that's sort of useful to prevent people from doing screen scraping for spam and so on. So I wouldn't expect somebody to go put this @ symbol like this in their email address when they make a submission. So what I want to do is write some business logic that at runtime goes and takes the email addresses from the submitters that are stored in the database and does that replacement and puts it on the page. So to do that, I'm going to add a new item to this project, and I think I have it running here, so I have to stop it. You can see, so this is the live version. That was the mock-up I showed you a moment ago. In the live version, we actually show the @ sign here at the moment. So I'm going to kill this and add a new item to the project. And the item is going to be a class, and I'm going to call the class submitter. Now, submitter was one of the tables that I saw that I had in my database. Now, if you're thinking that I'm now going to write a data class and have to declare the submitter ID and all that, I don't have to do any of that. All I want to do is write the code that will run when somebody asks for the email property. So to do that, it's really simple. Again, it's another naming convention. I'll just grab the code from here. So what I've done is written a function called getEmail. And this is a naming convention. There's a property called email, and I've written a function that is get followed by the property name. And that function returns a string. And what the data class generator is going to do at runtime, it sees a submitter table in the database, and it's going to want to go generate a submitter class. It's going to first look to see, is there a submitter class that already exists in this project? And if it does, it'll look for methods or functions that are named with this naming convention. So it'll see that there's a getEmail method defined, and it'll see there's an email property on the database. So when it goes and creates the property getter for that email property, it will insert a call to this function right in that getter. So nobody ever needs to work with this function directly. They can just manipulate the property, and this function will run. And so,
Question, Julie?
Is there a specific list of methods to use, or can you just put anything in front of email and it will find it?
so there is no. So there is get and set followed by property name. That's the only naming conventions we have. So this is one form of business logic. I want to show well, actually, I can show this running, and then I'll add another piece in a moment. So again, I haven't changed any of the code in the application to do any custom data binding or to do anything with the controls. I just have this getter in here, and the wiring will get hooked up. So another question while this is loading up? Yep. Question back there? Yeah.
So you're putting parentheses around the statements. Is Visual Basic converting to native language?
I'm sorry, I can't hear the question properly.
Is Visual Basic not your native language?
Visual Basic is not my native language, no.
Well, it's
Yeah.
not his native language.
Is that showing up in my coding here?
Parentheses around its.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, what can I say? So if you look at this, so the app started, and here automatically these things have now been replaced, and that's because my business logic that ran there. So that's one really simple thing. So let's do something a little more complicated. So I want to add a page to this project that allows me to add new stories. So rather than building all that markup again myself, I'm just going to add the existing item to the project. But I'm going to write some code that runs when the auto data source inserts a new item. So if I look at this page, there's just some standard markup in here. There's a form view for inserting stories in a form. And if I look at the code behind for this, there's one interesting piece. So the first thing that they've done there is do the same configuration of the auto data source for this page. And in this method, so this method is an event handler for the entity inserted method on the auto data source. So when that auto data source is about to go put something new into the database, it will call this event handler, and I can override the behavior that's there. So what I'm going to do is, because this application has sort of a complicated form where I can allow people to type in tag names just with text and so on, I need to write a little code in here to glue all that stuff together. So to do that, I'm going to get the object that's being inserted, and in the event args here, there's this entity property that describes the object. So now that I have it, I can set the properties of this. So I can set the topic of the story to the value that was specified in the control. And so again, I'll use the auto data source, and I'll use a new method here called getCurrentValue that will select the value from the control. So topics is, in this case, I believe it's a drop-down control. But with the auto data source, I don't need to know that. I don't need to know which property in the drop-down I need to look at and so on. The auto data source abstracts that for me and just allows me to get the value. So I've set the topic, and I'll set the tag. No, not tags. There's something else I need to set here. Pardon me. I just forgot for a moment what thing I'm setting. Submitter. So this is one of the drawbacks of not having IntelliSense in the API. So I'm going to get the current value of from the submitters control, and I'm going to set the story's published date to now. Now, I've got a little bit of code in here where I grab the tags out of the control. So two interesting things here. So I've got a tags control. I'm writing some code that does splitting of the tags on string. And in here, we create, using the dynamic context, on the tags collection, there is a create method, which will create a new tag object. So I just need to call that. I get a new tag. I set its properties. And notice I'm setting the story property, which is the backlink from the tag to the story. And I'm done. So this is sort of the customized, here's what I want to do on insert. One last thing that we'll do is we'll add another one of those data classes with a piece of business logic on it. So I'll add a new item. And on the story class, or I'll create a story class. And I want to make sure that people don't put in stories here that are too long. So in the description method, I've got a check that if the index is, or if the length is greater than 200, we'll just truncate it. And again, I'm using that naming convention, set followed by the property name, and that will make sure that this gets called when the description field is set. So with these things in place, we can run again. And as usual, I'll take a question while the page is loading. Okay, I'll take one in here.
Will those possible function names autopopulate with IntelliSense?
Those, so yes, because those functions are just statically declared methods on the class.
If you were to do a function space,
So
since there's a set number of functions you do,
that's right. So
it variably could happen.
So we have work to do to hook in the schema information into the IntelliSense system. And when we do that, certainly things like that become possible. Right? OK, so here we are. So this is my add a story page. So we have our submitter names here. These are members of the ADO.NET Jasper team. So I am Huddle Master. And I'm going to put in a story here saying Jasper talk went really well. And the URL, let's put the URL to my blog here. And we'll just say the audience loved this stuff. All right? That's accurate, right? And we'll put
No
in
presumption at all.
some tags here. Well, there's this psychology thing that if you just keep telling people what you want them to think, they'll think. So
It's called marketing.
yeah. So I added the story, and because I'm not a web guy, I didn't have it browse back to the page. But you can see here that my story got added, my email address, business logic ran, and my tags and everything work. And again, I had to write some code, but it was precisely the code I needed to write for the functionality of my application. No plumbing involved. So with that, we'll go back to some slide decks for a moment. And
Business logic you wrote, if you wanted to cancel that transaction, if it was longer than 200, maybe you just want to cancel
Cancel it.
Can you actually do that?
So I believe the auto data source has a cancel option on the event, in much the same way that the object data source does. So you can hook into any of the events in object data source and set the cancel property. I believe we have that. I believe it's called cancel. I just don't remember off the top of my head. So that was business logic. So just to clarify the naming convention, get property, set property, and you can write your code. Now, the interesting thing is, I didn't show this here, but within this business logic method, you have access to all the properties on that entity. If you wanted to look at and validate, well, is description longer, then I can actually look at that value and decide whether what I want to do with it in terms of my business logic. Now, so we've talked about IntelliSense, right? So we need IntelliSense. We're working with the language teams on this. This is a problem not specific to Jasper. It's in the dynamic language problem in general. But the good thing is there is some prior art in this area. So the way we do IntelliSense for XSD schemas, for example, that's an example of where we get type information from somewhere other than class definitions that exist at development time. So we're working on hooking these mechanisms together.
Right. People understand the reference when you do XML editing in the new VBXML project in Orcus. How many people went to the last talk or have heard about that stuff? Good. It's the same kind of mechanisms, right, where we're going to read that XSD into the background and we can provide you element and attribute IntelliSense. That's the same kind of work we need to do from the Jasper mechanisms, but it is the kind of thing we're trying to do across in Visual Studio.
Very good to know. Kind of confusing. When exactly do you generate all these material classes? If I'm a design document, you want to change the connection string.
It's actually when we build that connection string for you there. That's when we build the dynamic context. When we take that connection string and it has a little thing that says generate EDM defaults for you there, that's when we're actually building the model. There is another way to build the models that we'll talk about.
So those data classes don't exist until that thing runs. So that's why we're having challenges with IntelliSense right now. It's because when I'm writing that code, there's nothing in the system that understands that those classes exist. Well,
No.
so with an IntelliSense extension, we can certainly do some of that stuff in the design time experience, right?
I understand it's not done. I'm just trying to understand how it works today.
Yeah.
If I go and change that connection string and try to build this, then the build time is going to go and build that data context. And then
Yep. So at build time, those data classes don't exist at all. So all of the references to those data classes are late-bound calls. And in Visual Basic, when it sees something that it doesn't know about, it inserts a call to the late-bound helper, which resolves it at runtime. So it's quite possible that without IntelliSense, you could write code that then fails at runtime. That is a limitation today, and we're working on that.
It's a standard dynamic language kind of thing. Yep.
Yeah. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's sort of morally equivalent to typing the thing that goes to the submitters table and then you accidentally pointed at a database that doesn't have a submitters table. That code will fail dynamically. And that's why this is a great interactive environment. It's because it gives you that immediate feedback. The good news is that if you add tables or you slightly change the schema, it doesn't really affect the code that you've written as strongly because there are less things to keep maintained in parallel. And the bad news is that, yes, these dynamic things can bite you at runtime. And in the real world section, we'll talk about how to deal with some of that scalability and maintainability.
Okay, so let me move on because we're getting sort of to the end here. So we've alluded to real world databases, right? So let's look at a real example of that. So in here, I've got my ideal database that was all shaped just the way I want. But in reality, my database is probably going to look something like this. So I've got this data access city old school database that has a bunch of tables that, number one, have weird naming conventions, right? They're called like underscore table 212x and so on. But apart from the names, right? So names is one thing, and there's different ways to handle that. I've also done some crazy normalization here. So my stories table that was one table before is now stories and stories details, and the relationships to tags and topics are in their own separate link tables. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that I think there's anything wrong with this database, right? From a storage point of view, this may be the perfect way to create the database from an optimization standpoint, and those names might mean something from a version control perspective and so on. There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is, if we went and did default data class generation from this, it would be less than pleasant to be dealing with an underscore table 942x stories underscore tag link table object in the data classes. So to get around that, we have a mechanism, and you'll notice that in my web.config, I've been using this connection string all along, which has the generate default EDM. I have another connection string here where I specifically point to a data access EDM model that I've pre-written. So this is a standard ADO.NET Entity Framework model. We describe the data that we want to see. That's the conceptual model. We describe what the store looks like, and we say how we map between the two. So I've created a model that looks exactly like what I want it to look like. And now I can switch this application to using that database simply by changing the connection string that I use. So I'll go over to my the places where I touch the connection string. So I'll replace data access city with, let me actually cut and paste this from the web.config so I don't screw it up. So data access city specified EDM, place that here. The one other place I make a reference to the connection string is in the add a stories page. And here I'll change that as well. So I'm going to run this, and when I do, it will now start working against that other database. So people often say, well, you do this and it just works. How do you know you're not doing some crazy thing under the hoods to still be working against the simple database? So to prove to you that I'm not cheating here, I'm going to go in and delete this database that was all friendly and the way I wanted it to be. So there's no way it could be running against that after I delete it. And I'll show you that the app still works. So we'll close existing connections. And that database is gone, or will be gone in a moment. And let's get my app up. There we go. So there's the app. It's running, although it's saying not responding at the moment.
I think you had an error.
Oh, do I have an error? I don't think I have an error. I think it's just being a bit. Bear with me a moment. Dealing with Orcus Beta 1 here. But even to get this far to load the application is it's working against that database. Now, somebody asked, I'm going to let this run for a little while. I'm not entirely sure why this is still scrolling, but.
This isn't the new database. This has got the article you just added in your last.
Oh, that's true. I think actually, so that may be why it's. Okay, I think I had the session still around while I was doing that. So I need to restart the web server here. Apologize. So there, now you know I'm actually working with the real thing and not faking it here. So let's run this again.
You're an add a story.
Yeah. That's fine. We'll go back to the home page. OK, so while this is loading, someone down here asked a question about, I forget what the exact question was, about real-world databases a moment ago. Different. So OK, so you saw the issue about different names there. So this is the add a stories page. That's just where it happened to be when I hit run. I'll go here, and you'll notice that now I am working against the new database because the story that I added, well, I added it with the Jasper tag, which you can see is not even in here. So it's working against the database, and I can even, just because I'm using a complicated database doesn't mean that I can't submit a new story. So I'll just say new story, and just type in some text here and say Jasper, and click save. And even this will go straight back to the database. It should show up there at the end. There it is. So even with that weird, ugly database, we're able to figure out all the right mappings and stuff like that to get this to work.
So somebody had asked the question about, hey, doesn't it take a long time to grovel through the database and read, what if you have hundreds of tables? Well, the way you can deal with that is as you zero in on what you want your deployment model to be, you can build out the EDM model that you want, and you can skip the generate model step from inferring to the database. So as you go more and more into production phase, and you know the database you're dealing with, you can skip that type inference step by just supplying the model. Now, we'll still build the data classes over the model from type inference, but we don't have to grovel through the catalog to go through that step. So again, because we're layering over straight ADO.NET Entity Framework, we can reuse those pieces in the model as we go forward with it and make it more deployment ready.
So we've got to move because we have just a few minutes. Yep. But do you want to talk about this one?
Yep. So this is our nice scalability spectrum on the left. No customization. Use all the defaults, default data model. Use the data classes we generate from that. Sham showed you the unconventional name example. You can get into more complex databases, and the biggest problem for more complex databases, or the biggest thing we can do, is to help with normalization and factor things out, or factor things more appropriately. So when you're dealing with, say, a salesperson entity, you don't have to remember exactly how to join the employee table, the contact table, and the salesperson table just to get all the properties into one nice little package.
So the important point here is that there's two levels of customization. The full data model, where you want to reshape your data. In the world where you still want the default shape, but you just want to change the names, there's a way to customize the naming service we use.
So we mentioned briefly before that there's a stronger notion of metadata and metadata management. Here we're manipulating the metadata at runtime to take advantage of that. So you can actually directly access the runtime mappings after you've loaded the model, and you can do things like add aliases, employees for P2 and WEMP, for example, do prefix mapping, or even more complicated regex name mapping. So for the cases where you just need to do some name filtering, you can just manipulate it at runtime with these patterns and get the names to work out. And again, because the model itself is sort of a first-class artifact in our world, whether you want to load a complete model or manipulate it as you go, it has some concrete structure to it. Does that make sense? Okay. We're doing on timing.
Yeah, I think we should skip over this and just get to the feedback links.
Yep. So we're going to skip the video. The video is available online and other stuff. And we're just going to go right into feedback, and we'll take some questions.
Yeah.
So we are planning a second CTP before the end of the year. We really, really would like to have that depend a lot on the feedback that we get. Please do try out Jasper. We have a Jasper lab in the MIX sandbox. The CTP is available for download. The ADO.NET team blogs, Sham blogs, Andy and Carl's blogs all have recent news on Jasper. We can continue the mixed conversation in those blog places, as well as the Jasper forums, which we'll be watching.
Yep. Okay, question.
So from your real-world example, older databases, when we didn't have the idea of schema, or a lot of times instead of breaking out a schema, breaking separate databases on the same server.
Yeah.
Across databases?
So currently, as a limitation of the entity framework, a model must exist within one database. Or that is.
That connection screen.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's good feedback. That's something we would look at.
And the one other point about custom databases I didn't show here, a lot of times custom databases will require stored procedures. With the entity framework, you can map entity sets to stored procedures as well, so that ability is there. Question for me?
How do you handle optimistic concurrency?
So because we're built on the entity framework, again, that's sort of done, support for that is built in. And the entity framework has lots of ways to customize that, so you can specify specific columns to use and what behavior you want and so on.
You're still using ADO.NET under the hood, so you still have all the control that we would make available in the core APIs.
Yeah.
I have another big update query.
Yeah.
Are you updating record level or just field level when you do the updates?
We're writing update statements against rows in the database, right? So based on the key, we update a single row at a time.
But you update every record in that field regardless of whether it's changed?
No. We update only the fields that have changed. So there is some intelligence around that to determine.
We do compute that update difference.
Yeah. Julie had a question?
I'm a little hesitant to ask this, but this looks like it's kind of fan flames between the LINQ-SQL or entity framework discussion. And I was just wondering, I know you have to have already thought about that, but I'm just wondering, and this is different, right? You don't even have to create the designer in advance, et cetera. But is there going to be some clarity? I mean, do you guys already have some clarity over, guidance on that? I know it's an incubator project, but I think, that's a big topic right now. So.
Well, the guidance really is that we'd be looking for feedback about what Jasper does, right? Which is automate the tedious process of data binding against forms in these specific scenarios. This is the kind of engine that you could build over another OR framework if you wanted to. It happens to be that I think the power of the entity framework's mapping engine is more suited to the kinds of things we're going to do at the name resolution level than another OR framework. But if there was demand for this over LINQ-SQL, that'd be interesting feedback for us, and we'd respond to that.
Question down here?
A couple of questions. First one is, when you have a database that I didn't build myself, that is not necessarily normalized, nor does it make any sense, and it has over 100 tables with millions of rows.
Yeah.
And is Jasper built for something like that? And if so, how big the EDM is supposed to be? The second question is, how does Jasper play a role in when you're trying to separate the data models and the data component of the system, then your code and your business logic? Because Jasper doesn't seem to build for that. It seems to be more in line with the stuff.
So,
That played for me anyway.
so let me answer the two parts of that question separately. So for the first part, in terms of the databases that you are unfamiliar with and don't make any sense, because, again, of the power of the mapping engine and the entity framework, most of those databases can be mapped. There are some restrictions, but in general, the space of things that can be mapped is very powerful. And there are tools that we're working on releasing with the framework later on. There was a video in here which we didn't have time to show that illustrates how that works. But there's an ability to build a data model sort of with some drag and drop actions and so on from a schema that's unfriendly, right? So that's kind of our answer there. And the entity framework is built for scale, and it's built for performance. And the idea is that you can use it with the largest of databases out there. So to your second question about the separation of the data model from the code and so on, I mean, one of the nice things about Jasper is because we never manifest those data classes in code in source files anywhere, your data model effectively lives in your database, right? And what you're working with is a set of things that are generated at runtime that correspond to the shape